absolutely horrific serial killer that you have likely never heard of.
Portraying me as being non-human, and their motivation is no separate from the way I treated my victims. I treated them as something less than human, nothing more than a play toy or not a play object. This is what the media has done to me. It's dehumanized me.
We are so close to Halloween, and the entire month of October I've been sharing with you guys the most horrific, terrifying true crime cases I've ever heard of, and I do have to put a content warning on today's video. Bob Berdella is a monster. Bob Berdella grew up in a really religious family. His father was very strict, borderline abusive, but Bob was still desperate for his father's approval. As a child, Bob was an outcast. He was bullied. He didn't really have any friends, but honestly, Bob really looked down on his peers. He was very smart, and he had an inflated ego and definitely saw everyone as below him. When Bob was a teenager, he realized he was gay, which was hard on him because he came from this religious family, so he felt like he had to keep it a secret. And then as soon as he was coming to terms with this, his father randomly had a heart attack and died at only the age of 39. So the approval that he was always desperate to get from his father, he realized that he was never going to get. And if that wasn't hard enough, shortly after his father died, Bob was actually SA'd by one of his older coworkers at his part-time job. Bob was very lonely and in a lot of pain. But Bob found comfort and joy in his favorite movie called The Collector, and this movie definitely altered Bob's brain chemistry. The plot centers around a man who becomes so obsessed with one of his female coworkers that he kidnaps her and holds her captive in hope of her one day falling in love with him. For college, Bob went to art school and out of nowhere starts showing the most disturbing behavior ever. 18-year-old Bob would bring animals into his class and hurt them in the name of art, like he would call it an art project. For one of these projects, Bob brought a duck into his school and boiled it alive in front of his entire class. And then on 2 separate days, Bob brought a chicken and a dog into class, injected them with so much substances until they both passed away. And I guess the third time killing an animal in front of his entire class was the last straw because Bob was expelled. After this, Bob found work. He opened his own company up. He bought a house. He started to show more confidence. People started to like him. He joined the neighborhood watch. At this point, Bob was out and proud. He started a very serious long-term relationship with another man, but that man ended up breaking up with Bob, which broke his heart, and once again, he was completely alone. So Bob found comfort in the arms of young male S-workers, and Bob really liked them young. They were like teenage boys. And a lot of these young men were extremely vulnerable. Some of them were addicts or really poor or living on the street. So Bob would offer these teenage boys or really young men to come live with him, but of course he would expect some things in return. But Bob still had this fantasy from when he was younger, watching his favorite movie of holding someone captive, having complete control over them until they fell in love with him. Bob, who was in his mid-30s, chooses his first victim, a 19-year-old boy named Jerry Howell, and Bob had actually known Jerry since Jerry was 14 years old. Jerry really looked up to Bob and trusted him. And then one evening in 1984, Bob sedated Jerry by giving him a bunch of substances until Jerry was unconscious. Bob then tied up Jerry in his house and essayed him for hours. Bob was also essaying Jerry with different objects and different foods like carrots. He was also beating Jerry and was continuously giving Jerry substances to keep him unconscious. Bob also had something over Jerry's mouth, and at one point Jerry began to get sick, but he had something over his mouth, so he ended up choking on it and passing away. And Bob was not upset at all that Jerry had just passed away. He was only upset that he had lost his prisoner. And to dispose of Jerry's body, he just put him in trash bags and put him on the side of the road to come be taken by the garbage truck and taken to the landfill. Bob's next victim was 18-year-old Robert Sheldon. He also essayed him and beat him for hours. But at this point, Bob actually realized that he liked to watch people in pain, like causing pain to his victims would get him off. So now all of Bob's victims were being brutally tortured. He would put chemicals or needles in their eyes. He would burn them, break their bones, electrocute them, and much, much worse. Pretty much anything you could think of to torture someone, Bob was doing it to these young men that trusted him. And the entire thing would be documented in Bob's diary and also with the hundreds of Polaroid photos that he was taking. Most of Bob's victims would succumb to their injuries after being tortured for hours or days, or Bob would suffocate them and all of their bodies would be left out for the trash and taken to the landfill. Bob's third victim was 20-year-old Mark Wallace. Mark was not an S worker. He actually did gardening for Bob. One day he left for work and he never came home. His fourth and fifth victims were 20-year-old Walter Ferris, who was married and also a father, and 21-year-old Todd Stoops. Both of these young men succumbed to their injuries or from their infections. And Bob was really upset with himself because he wanted his victims to stay alive. He was really, really disappointed because they were supposed to stay alive so they would fall in love with him. But he felt like he could not stop torturing them because that's what got him excited. All of these young men were passing away within days of him kidnapping them. So when Bob kidnapped 20-year-old Larry Pearson, he was determined to keep him alive, and Larry was being held captive by Bob for months. And Larry was being brutally essayed by Bob every single day for hours, and he would have to pretend like he liked it because the longer that Bob kept Larry, the more he began to trust him. Bob had actually convinced himself that Larry had fallen in love with him. They would watch movies together, they would eat breakfast together, and one day Bob asked Larry to do a certain act on him. So when Larry went down on Bob, Larry bit down as hard as he could, nearly biting off Bob's manhood. Bob immediately rushed himself to the hospital, and I don't know how you're able to explain an injury like that. And unfortunately, the hospital was able to stitch Bob back up. But they told him that he would have to stay at the hospital for a few days. So Bob told the hospital that he had something he had to handle at home and he would be right back. So Bob took a taxi back to his house, and then he went to his house and he did unalive Larry. And then he packed up a few things and then got back in the same taxi that took him to the hospital. So that taxi waited outside for Bob while Bob went in and murdered someone. And then by the time that Bob was back at the hospital, he was there for the next 3 days. The entire time, Larry's body was still in Bob's house. Bob's seventh victim was actually the only one that he did not know before kidnapping. And that was 21-year-old Chris Bryson, who was an S worker. Bob picked him up, brought him back home, did the same thing he always did. He would knock him out with substances, tie them up, and then essay them for hours. Bob told Chris to follow the rules and he would not hurt him. He also showed him Polaroid photos that he had taken of his first 6 victims and told Chris that they were all dead because they did not follow the rules. Chris was being brutally essayed by Bob for hours every single day and also with objects, and Bob also attempted to put bleach in Chris's eyes to blind him. But it honestly seemed like Bob was trying to recreate the relationship that he thought he had with his last victim, because even though he did not know Chris, he trusted him within days. And only after imprisoning Chris for 2 days, he convinced himself that Chris had already fallen in love with him. And he actually allowed Chris a lot more privileges that his other victims did not get. And one of these privileges is that Bob would not knock Chris unconscious whenever he would leave the house. Like on April 2nd, 1980, when Bob left the house and did not knock Chris unconscious. And Chris knew that this was his chance. He was able to slip his arms out of the ropes that were used to tie him up, but he was even too scared to leave the room that he was being held captive in. He was too afraid to walk throughout the entire house because he did not know when Bob was going to be coming home. So Chris actually jumped out of a 2-story window, breaking some bone on the way down, but he did not care. He just ran up to the first person he saw. And also, didn't even mention this, Chris is not wearing anything but a dog collar. But luckily, the person that saw him did help him and 911 was called. And when the police got there, Chris was able to show them which house he was being held captive in, told them that a man named Bob had held him captive, and also that there were other victims before him. When Bob was arrested, at first, he was only being charged with the essay of Chris Bryson, but when Bob was in custody, he refused to cooperate or talk to anyone. And when they got a search warrant to his house, it was a terrifying sight. They actually found the skull of 2 of his victims that he had kept as trophies, and also the 400 something Polaroids that he had taken to document the torture and essay of his victims. And some of these Polaroids are available online, but like I always say, you can never unsee something, so just think about that before you go looking up things. When it actually came to charging Bob with murder, it was unclear how many victims he had. All they had were these Polaroids and these 2 skulls, because Bob had always put his victims out in the trash and he wasn't talking. So at first, Bob was only going to be charged with 1 murder. They were going for the death penalty, and when it came for him to, plead guilty or not guilty, everyone was expecting him to plead not guilty because he hadn't talked to anyone, he hadn't said a single word, being completely uncooperative. But Bob shocked everyone and he pled guilty because he was afraid of the death penalty and he wanted to make a deal. So Bob made a very full and very detailed confession and was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole.